Affairs Director for the Irrigation Association. Welcome to our first webinar of 2015 in the Bringing Water to Life webinar series. This one is going to focus a little bit on the midterm elections that occurred in November and what that means for irrigated agriculture. Take a little look at what the top issues are going on mainly in Washington, D.C., and really how those elections are affecting how these the Congress administration are viewing top issues that affect our industry's livelihood. So I appreciate all of you joining in. Usually I'm the one that introduces these webinars, but I'm going to be the one giving the webinar today, which is pretty exciting, and hope you'll find it interesting and rewarding at the same time. Just a little housekeeping before this webinar begins. Excuse me, this webinar is being recorded. So those of you who are interested in viewing a recording of this webinar after it's completed, visit our website, irrigation.org/webinar_series. We usually get these webinars posted by the beginning of the following week, so by Monday or Tuesday of next week, it should be up and linked on that website. I will be having a Q&A period at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions at all, please take note and type them into the little question box that is in your GoToWebinar toolbar, and I'll reference those at the end of the webinar. Because of the amount of folks that participate in these things, we really can't have an open Q&A session, so we found that just typing in the questions and referencing them that way really works well in this setting. Also, we are very fortunate that we are able to provide Irrigation Association continuing education units for these webinars. So please keep a record of your attendance. Your attendance has already been noted in our system if you are certified, and you'll be receiving a CEU for this. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to contact either me or our education and certification staff at the IA after the webinar. We'll be able to help you out with any questions regarding CEUs for this webinar. For those of you who aren't aware, I usually go through a little bit on who the Irrigation Association is. While this webinar is focused more so on our irrigated agriculture component of the webinar, we are pretty broad and diverse. We also look at landscape and golf irrigation as well, having membership consisting of manufacturers, dealers, distributors, contractors, consultants, etc. on the landscape and golf side. And in the agriculture side, anywhere from the manufacturers, dealers, end users, providers. So we really touch on a lot of aspects of the irrigation industry, really striving to be the recognized authority on irrigation. Excuse me, you'll see in front of you here is our strategic plan that was approved a few years ago with the main mission to promote efficient irrigation. And tying into the legislative side and our public affairs side, that is really what brings us together, promoting efficient irrigation as a solution, whether it's a solution to increase the amount of yield that we're trying to produce, either in agriculture or in the turf, landscape, and golf course side, or the environmental side, with promoting water conservation, promoting clean water through direct application of water, limiting the amount of runoff. So really promote efficient irrigation in a wide variety of ranges, a solution depending on what the needs and wants of the issue are. Strategic initiatives, I mentioned advocacy here, and that's what we're going to be talking about mainly on the government affairs and public affairs side. But you'll notice everything that we base our advocacy on is really brought out from our education, training, and certification side. Without this component, we wouldn't have the expertise we have to bring to the table to advocate on behalf of the industry. And then with the support initiatives being membership, we wouldn't be who we are without our membership, and then the irrigation show as well. So let's dive right into the topics at hand. In 2014, we saw a big, really, some are calling it wave, some are calling it shift, and a lot of thinking. But let's start out with talking about the governor election results. In front of you now is a map of the United States, and you can see where there were elections, which way those elections turned. For the most part, Republicans had a very good day on the gubernatorial election side last November. You'll notice that there are some surprises that occurred, one being in my home state of Maryland, where the Republican upset the Democratic candidates. The incumbent was not running this election, and so you had two newcomers in, with the Democrat being heavily favored, and the Republican ended up having an upset in the state of Maryland. Conversely, the only seat that Republicans lost that they held was in Pennsylvania, where the incumbent was hit hard by various issues in the state, and the Democrat came out victorious. But taking a look at these at the states, I want to just focus on four. And let's look at the top four irrigated agriculture states and what happened in those states and who came out victorious. So let's look at Nebraska first. The 2013 Farm Ranch Irrigation Survey has Nebraska being the top irrigated state, acreage-wise, in the United States. Let's take a look at Nebraska. You have a newcomer in with Pete Ricketts. He was part of a very heavily contested primary in 2000, and that should be 2014, not 2004. You can see he came out with 26.4% of the vote out of a heavily contested field of candidates on the Republican primary side. And to be honest, he was beat up, and he had a very high hill to climb, high mountain to climb, to overcome that very contentious primary that occurred. Well, you can see that he came out victorious with 57.21% of the vote in Nebraska. And I can tell you, having just been to Nebraska, that he's already making a lot of ins with the irrigation industry in that state, which is very good, really relying on the industry for various appointments throughout its administration, relying on the industry for information about agriculture and water use, groundwater use, et cetera. So it's very good. So you can see Nebraska with the new governor will possibly see some new things regarding water policy coming out of that state in the next 4 years. Next up is California, and really no surprise in California. You have Jerry Brown, the incumbent, won pretty handily in 2014. Some interesting notes about Jerry Brown. He turned 77 years old on April 7th. He was the 6th youngest member of governor of California when he was originally governor from 1975 to 1983, and is currently serving as the oldest ever elected governor in the state of California. So it's kind of interesting that you have Jerry Brown, who was governor for so long, back from 75 to 83, and again from 2011 to the present. Water has been a central focus of his administration, and it's really been a part of his family for years. Water infrastructure, water funding, and really the current drought in California, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the webinar, has really thrust Jerry Brown and his legacy right now to be focused on how they're going to manage water to come out of this drought in a positive manner. Last year, the legislature passed the water bond, and then it was approved during the election of 2014. You had groundwater legislation passed at the 11th hour last year, and groundwater has never been regulated in California. With the amount of drilling that's currently occurring due to the lack of ground or surface water available for irrigation, water use is really turning to drilling for water, and with it not regulating, really pushed the legislature and the governor to make some pretty big decisions in a very short amount of time last year. And then, of course, the drought. You know, how are we going to manage our water infrastructure in California? How are we going to manage agricultural water use in California? So all of these decisions are being made, and having Jerry Brown as governor through his focus on water use in California, it's going to mean a lot, having him being reelected in California. Let's take a look at Arkansas. Asa Hutchinson was elected the governor of Arkansas. He's a first-term governor, former member of the House of Representatives. Not much background in agriculture. His focus in the House of Representatives was really on illegal drug use and the amount of drugs that were taken and illegally brought into the United States. And then he was appointed administrator of the DEA from 2001 to 2003 because of his focus on illegal drug use in the United States. As a congressman, President George W. Bush appointed him as director of the DEA from 2001 to 2003. Now, with Arkansas being the third highest water user in agriculture for irrigated agriculture, in terms of acreage in the United States, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for education in Arkansas on water use. They have both groundwater and surface water used in Arkansas, and I know that agriculture is a big component of the state. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities there for the industry to come in and really work with Governor Hutchinson on water policy and water use. Stemming from the drought of 2012, I don't think anybody there wants to go through what they went through in the past. So it's going to be interesting to see what his focus is on agriculture throughout his term as governor. And then finally in Texas, you have Republican Greg Abbott beating Democrat Wendy Davis. You can see the numbers on your screen that it was not necessarily a landslide, but he won very handily. This gubernatorial race garnered national attention mainly due to the Democratic challenger of Wendy Davis. She is best known for her filibustering of abortion legislation in Texas that really catapulted her to the limelight in Texas and throughout the United States, and really had a focus on that gubernatorial race nationally. But again, Greg Abbott came out victorious in November. Governor Abbott's background is on the law side. He was appointed to Texas Supreme Court by Governor George W. Bush in 1996 for a 2-year term, and again in 1998 for another term. And then he served as the Attorney General of Texas from 2002 to 2015, and that was his background coming into the election of 2015. Interesting to note, he is a paraplegic in Texas and has done a lot for tort reform in that state, as well as research, funding, and focus on paraplegic issues in the state. So that's been another focus of his coming into that election. So that's looking at on the state side, on the top 4 irrigated states. And we can talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in your states. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask them. But I wanted to spend the bulk of the webinar talking about what's going on in Congress and how that's affecting the issues that Congress is going to be working on, as well as the administration. And a lot of times, these stories are best told by cartoons. Good or bad, best told that way. And this is a cartoon that ran in Roll Call, which is a Capitol Hill newspaper, after the election, moving into the 114th Congress in January. You can see here the Senate is open for business under new management, and the Democrats walking in as cartoon donkeys, just saying that they're feeling kind of down and blue about this, as well they should be. You can see by this state is that Republicans had a net 9-seat gain throughout the United States Senate, which is more than anyone thought was possible. It was kind of a chance that Republicans were going to take over, but I don't think anybody thought that they would have a net 9 gain. I thought anywhere from net 6 to 7, possibly 8 were what pundits were thinking of, but 9 seats ended up on what we're seeing. This is the final count right here. 54 Republican, 44 Democrat, and 2 independent. The 2 independent seats are in Vermont and Maine. So you can see here that is the current breakdown. You'll see in Louisiana, there was a runoff in Louisiana because the 2 top candidates didn't get a majority of the vote, with the Democrat Mary Lander ended up losing that race later on. So, well, let's look at the states with a GOP gain that occurred. First, Alaska, Dan Sullivan. Arkansas, Tom Cotton. Colorado, Cory Gardner. Iowa, Joni Ernst, and I'll explain those asterisks here in a second. Louisiana, Bill Cassidy. Montana, Steve Daines. North Carolina, Tom Tillis. South Dakota, Mike Rounds. West Virginia, Shelley Moore Capito. And you can see some of the surprises here. I'd say North Carolina was a pretty big surprise. Colorado, not necessarily a surprise, but it was a highly contentious race and was pretty much a toss-up in that state. So you can see some of these states, while not a huge surprise, these are all either incumbents or seats that were held by Democrats that were taken over by Republicans. And then other new GOP senators that are out there, and I'm really focusing on the GOP here because they're the ones that are in control, that are setting the legislative agenda in the state. So other new GOP senators taken from a GOP incumbent, Georgia and Nebraska with David Perdue and Ben Sasse. And these asterisks that are on here, you notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4 asterisks. These mean that they are members of the Senate Ag Committee. So out of all of the new leadership that are coming in, the new majority that are coming in, 4 out of the 9 have been named to the Senate Ag Committee, which is pretty important. And you look at the states where these folks come from, you have Nebraska, which is a big irrigated state. You have Georgia, which has their own water problems. North Carolina has dealt with drought in the past. And Iowa, though a dryland state primarily, has coped with significant drought 3 years ago. And Joni has also been kind of thrust into the national spotlight with giving the Republican address after the State of the Union a few weeks ago. Here's a map of the House. What we're seeing here is Republican 247 to 188 Democratic seats. Republican had a plus 13 seat gain last year, which is, again, more than anyone thought was going to happen. But you can see, really, it's not really a surprise with Republicans having the majority of what are generally called the heartland of the United States, anywhere from West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, the whole way through to California, with the blue parts primarily representing the more populated areas, the cities throughout the United States, and the rural areas being mostly comprised of Republicans. That's really a generalization. There are some differences here and there, but generally that's what we're seeing. Some things to note. Again, I live in Maryland, so I can point that out. You see the state of Maryland is primarily blue, but there's a Republican governor now. And Pennsylvania, primarily red, is Democratic governor now. A lot of these things are going flip-flop because of what's going on both in the state and reaction nationally. The Republicans are taking this as a referendum on Obama's policies, President Obama's policies, and they're really bringing that into their legislative focus this year as well. So with everything that's going on, whether it's Obamacare or overregulation or taxes or what have you, what the reasons were, a lot of these elections that were surprises were really taken because of the national perspective. So I'm going to show a few cartoons here. And you can see here you have the House majority and the Senate majority coming in, and they're kind of doing the elephant way of fist bumping with their noses, being very excited about having a majority straight through to 2016, which is the presidential election year, with the governing trap right between them. And this really means that Republicans have an opportunity here to act as really governing the government, really acting as managers of the government, which is something that is more easily said than done. A lot of times, last Congress was called a do-nothing Congress, which I'll get into in a second. But a lot of times, when new majority of the full Congress comes in, they fall into this trap of doing nothing and not really managing properly, and then ending up losing it anywhere from 2 to 4 years later. So I know the Republicans are really working hard now to stay out of trouble, keep their nose clean, and move forward into the 2016 election cycle. For those of you who watched the presidential State of the Union address last month, President Obama really touted his ability for the veto pen. And I think we're going to see a lot of that this year, with the Republicans now holding majorities in the House and Senate for those bills that can pass a filibuster in the Senate, specifically that the president disagrees with. He's not going to be afraid to use his veto pen. And I don't mean to pick on President Obama here, but I just want to highlight some differences in what we're hearing from him that are different from presidents that we've heard from in the past when they represent a different political party than who holds the majority in Congress. So President Obama is really not taking the difference of political party change in Congress throughout his term as president as meaning that he should change the way that he views issues that he stands firm on, whether it's government funding, whether it's regulation or health care reform, what have you. He's really sticking to his guns here. He's not changing much. And I think that from what I've read and seen and spoken with people, he's really entrenching himself into his philosophical issues and not really moving off of them. There may be some things here and there that he's willing to work with Republicans on, but we're not seeing the amount of him moving over towards the center or to the right of issues than we've seen with other presidents. When President Clinton held the presidency in 1994 and Republicans took over the House of Representatives and controlled Congress then, you had the contract with America, Newt Gingrich elected Speaker of the House. You saw a little bit more moving over towards the center from Bill Clinton, and it really had to do with government spending, government programs, et cetera, with balancing the budget. You saw more of that with him. So I think you see a little bit different with Obama's philosophical thinking. And then you have here, and we're seeing a lot of this rhetoric right now throughout Washington, D.C., with 113th Congress being really deemed as a do-nothing Congress, when they really did not get anything done. Not only could the House and Speaker Boehner work well with President Obama, but President Obama couldn't really come to an agreement with Majority Leader Reid in the Senate, and then conversely similarly with Reid and Boehner not really coming to an agreement on anything either. So you had Speaker Boehner in the House of Representatives, you had Majority Leader Reid in the Senate, and you had President Obama. And the three of them had a lot of difficulty really coming to an agreement on what this Congress should do. And because of that, there was a record low number of bills that were signed into law that year by the president. So really being deemed as a do-nothing Congress. And you're seeing here with the baby running away with the 114th Congress, you ain't seen nothing yet. And this goes back to the governing trap and the president's veto pen. With a lot of this remains to be seen. What this Congress can do remains to be seen. And it's really contingent upon how much the House and Senate can work with President Obama to come to areas of agreement. So where are there opportunities for agreement focusing on irrigated agriculture? So let's look at the issues. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the issues, and we'll dive into each one here down the road. First thing we talk about is the EPA's Waters of the United States proposed rule, and many of you have heard of this already. Other one's tax reform, budget, which the president's budget recently came out, the drought, and then farm bill implementation. So these are all issues that really affect irrigated agriculture one way or another. Some directly, some indirectly, but they all have, our industry has a hand in each one. So let's talk about the EPA and the waters of the United States. And I'm going to first talk about, I'm going to leave this graphic up here on the screen while I talk a little bit about the political realities of what's going on here. Well, first let's talk about the graphic. What you see here on the left-hand side of the screen, to the left of the red orangish dotted line, is the EPA's current authority on the Clean Water Act jurisdiction. You see in there you have estuary, a river, a lake, perennial stream, etc. So you can see there that's the current authority that's being implemented for jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. Now, since the Clean Water Act was passed in the 1970s, it's never really gone through what we call in Washington, D.C., a rulemaking process. It's always been, once it was passed, it immediately went into the courts under lawsuits up to the Supreme Court. So it's been tied up in judicial, I guess, in jurisdiction with, just opinions coming out regarding what the Clean Water Act should and should not oversee. Usually what happens when a bill is passed by Congress and signed into law, that immediately goes into a public comment period and a rulemaking process with the agency that has jurisdiction over that issue puts out a proposed rule on how this legislation will be implemented. Public gives feedback, and then the final rule on how it will be implemented is produced. Well, this has never happened with the Clean Water Act. So it took from when the Clean Water Act was originally passed by Congress to 2014 when the proposed rule came out. And this proposed rule, you can see from the agricultural industry's perspective, expands jurisdiction a lot. So you can see that it expands it into ditches and fields, roadside ditches, small wetlands, in farm fields, isolated wetlands, etc., small ponds. So it really expands it tremendously. Now, the EPA will come back. We've had conversations with them and said, well, there's a lot of ways that ag is exempt from a lot of these rules. But the thing is, if you, from the agricultural industry's perspective, a lot of these things can and probably will be under the jurisdiction of the EPA's Clean Water Act by the EPA if this rule were to come to fruition. The oversight committees on this are the House Transportation and Infrastructure. The chair is Bill Schuster from Pennsylvania. And the Senate is the Environment and Public Works Committee. The chair is Jim Inhofe in Oklahoma. These two members of Congress, Congressman and Senator, are lock-in-step agreement that this goes far beyond what the original intent of the scope of the Clean Water Act should have been when it was passed by Congress. So this just gives a good representation of what we feel as an industry, and I see the industry broadly with ag and manufacturing and business, et cetera, how we feel this rule is going to be expanded if brought into final stage this year. Giving some examples of what we're seeing in a few states here with the waters of the United States. The EPA's traditional jurisdiction in Colorado is to the left. You can see streams that flow all the time, early seasonally, rain or not. About 5 million, almost 6 million acres, between 5 and 6 million acres, 104,000 stream miles. And then if WOTUS were to pass as is, go through rule promulgation as is, it would jump up to more than 7 million acres, and it would just about double the amount of stream miles that, or over double the amount of stream miles that the Clean Water Act would have jurisdiction of. Now, in a state that already has a lot of water issues with the Colorado River and the Colorado River Basin, having expanded scope for regulation on water that is right now owned by the state and now brought into federal jurisdiction is going to be significantly problematic for those water users that rely on these streams, rivers, et cetera, in Colorado. See, in Florida, another state where they have water issues, or traditional jurisdiction, you have about 12 million, almost 13 million acres at 55 million stream miles. If this rule goes through, you have 13.1 million acres with 99 stream miles under the new jurisdiction, which again almost doubles the amount of stream miles under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act if this rule were to go through as written. And finally, Arkansas. Talked a little bit about that earlier on with the gubernatorial race. You have 5 million acres, 5.5 million acres under current jurisdiction, 88,000 stream miles. If WOTUS goes through as written, goes up to 5.8 million acres, 136 stream miles. So this is a big deal for agriculture in terms of water availability and water use, whether it's what water can be used by agriculture and how the water is used on farm and the runoff that occurs from the farms into the streams and the wetlands. So moving on from WOTUS, let's look at tax reform real quick. So tax reform has two oversight committees, one in the House, one in the Senate. So let's look at the House real quick first, the House Ways and Means Committee. The chairman is Paul Ryan, and Paul Ryan, many of you know from being Mitt Romney's running mate, a vice presidential candidate under his election, under the Republican candidacy, last election cycle. On Tuesday, the Ways and Means Committee moved forward with 7 bills addressing tax certainty for individual and small businesses. Paul Ryan's background is on the House Budget Committee, and his goal in the House Budget Committee was to bring down government spending, get government spending under control, balancing the budget, and reducing the deficit. And he is, I don't know if it's a lightning rod is a good term to describe Paul Ryan, but he is very smart and engaged on these issues. And so he's going to use his role as the new chair of the Ways and Means Committee to do the same thing without raising taxes. Senate Finance Committee, you have Chairman Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah. At the end of last year, after Republicans took control of Congress and then won the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate Finance Committee put forth 7 guiding principles of tax reform. And they're on your screen there, ranging from economic growth, fairness, simplicity, revenue neutrality, performance, competitiveness, and incentives for savings and investment. So those are the 7 guiding principles of tax reform in the Senate Finance Committee. These two guys are working together on broad tax reform. So what you're going to see for the next 2 years is both legislatively and politically, tax reform being more and more in the news, in the spotlight. And because of this, there's a lot of opportunities for the industry, whether it's on the manufacturing side, with looking at ways to promote manufacturing for agricultural equipment, irrigation equipment in the United States, or looking at additional tax incentives for appropriate water use and conservation in agriculture, tied to increased yield, et cetera. So that we're looking at a lot of these things in the tax reform realm this year, which is becoming more and more of a big issue in Congress. Now, with that said, President Obama is pretty entrenched himself on a lot of these issues. So getting something through Congress is just the first battle. President Obama is coming at this from a different political perspective than Congress. So while I have high hopes for a good tax reform bill coming out of Congress in the next 2 years, I am a bit more skeptical on something that can come out of Congress that would be agreed upon by the President to be signed into law. So let's look at the budget. The goal for this year is to bring the budget back into regular order. For the past, many years, a handful of years, we have not been in regular order in the budget cycle. What regular order means is you have the President, they put together a budget on how they feel money should be spent throughout the federal government, and that is sent to Congress. Congress then reacts to that budget, either uses it as a base for a budget to be put together and then passed by Congress, or they basically put it dead on arrival and put together their own budget to send back to the President to be signed into law. Now, for the past few years, handful of years, that has not happened. Yes, the President has put together a budget, but either Congress has either not come to an agreement on a budget, or they have sent the President a budget that was not agreed upon by the President and not signed by the President. So what happens then is we just go to the appropriations process. And we go to continuing resolutions, and all government spending is really based on what was spent the last fiscal year. And what was spent the last fiscal year was really what was based on spent the fiscal year before that. And we get into a lot of problems then with omnibus bills and grand agreements by budget and appropriations chairman at the last minute. So the goal is to get away from that and back to regular order. And I know that the members of Congress that are looking at the budget this year really want this to happen. The House Budget Committee Chair is Tom Price, Republican from Georgia. Senate Budget Committee Chair is Mike Enzi, Republican from Washington. So the President's budget was just sent out about a week ago, and really haven't had enough time to digest every single detail of what's in that budget, and the House and Senate have not yet come out with their own proposals on the budget either. So let's take a look real quick about some highlights of the President's budget proposal and what's in there. It increases spending by $74 billion, and that's an important note to remember. It increases tax revenue by $2.1 trillion. President Obama stated that he will not sign a budget that does not increase federal spending. Now let's go back and look at the chairs of the House and Senate Budget Committee. One is Tom Price, Republican from Georgia, pretty conservative member of Congress, and Mike Enzi, Republican from Wyoming, same thing. With Republicans holding the House and the Senate majorities, passing a budget that increases federal spending is not going to happen. If I had a crystal ball right now, or I was a betting man in Las Vegas, I would put some money down saying that that would not happen. So we're once again in, right now, a deadlock with the president saying, I'm not going to sign a budget that does not increase taxes and does not increase federal spending. Well, budget chairs now are in a position where they need to take this into consideration and determine what do they want to do next. Do they want to pass a budget that balances the budget, or are they going to pass a budget that increases federal spending? Remains to be seen, but my opinions are what they are, and I do not see them passing any kind of budget that increases federal spending. Now, how does this affect agriculture? It makes significant cuts to crop insurance, and it also affects the amount of money. Now, let me take a step back here. When I say significant cuts to crop insurance, the crop insurance industry has come out and said this decimates crop insurance. The president's budget will have significant detrimental effects to how crop insurance is provided right now, and goes completely against what was passed as part of the 2014 Farm Bill. Farm Bill spending, the amount of money that's available, even though it's mandatory spending, is affected by the budget. So we look at anywhere from the amount of money that goes to agricultural spending, including crop insurance, conservation programs, et cetera, the amount of money that goes to regulatory activities. So much money is given to the EPA to regulate agriculture, to regulate clean water, to regulate clean air. So how much money is given to them from the budget to do what they, in their minds, want to set out to do? The president has gone on the table and said, I'm going to give this amount of money, and the Republicans are going to come at it with their perspective as well. If Congress does not pass a budget, what's going to happen, again, is all federal spending is going to be based off of what the current spending is, which we are, again, under an omnibus bill, which is a continuing resolution off of what was spent the previous years. So let's go into drought, because this is a big issue for our industry, the irrigated agriculture industry, and it's a big issue for Congress as well. So let's look at where we are in drought right now. California, again, that continues to gain a lot of the news. I know they're seeing some rain out in California this week. I'm in California right now, but it continues to be in significant drought. Also, it sweeps up into Nevada, up to Oregon, some parts of Texas, into Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, so really Colorado. So really, the western part of the United States continues to be under drought. This is a little bit different than what we saw 3 years ago during drought 2012, which was really in the mid part of the United States with Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, down into Mississippi, Arkansas. That was under significant drought. They're doing pretty well right now in terms of rainfall. But out west is really where the quote-unquote action or lack of action is in terms of rainfall and drought. And this is pretty important because a lot of what can help out this drought is overseen by the federal government. Yes, the states are doing a lot to oversee the amount of water that is available for ag and urban uses by the water they own, but there are a lot of things that the federal government can do as well, if given the appetite. Again, I go back to cartoons. President Obama visited the Central Valley of California last year and used it as an opportunity to talk about climate change. And I only say that, and I feel like I'm taking on Obama a lot here, but I'm only reflecting what the opinions are of the agricultural industry right now in terms of federal government. Came out and talked about climate change, didn't really talk about the drought, and didn't touch upon what's causing a lot of the water that can be available to California farmers, and that is being tied up with the Delta smelt conversation in the Bay Delta. So you see there with the president coming in and saying, talking to a farmer, I'm here to help, but the viewpoint of agriculture is, yeah, he's here to help the Delta smelt fish and not help my farm succeed and get the yield needed. So what legislation has been out there thus far? And who are the major players? So the major players right now primarily are Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, and Representative Devin Nunes, Republican from California. Now, fortunately, Dianne Feinstein is really walking in middle of the road here. Devin Nunes is a lightning rod in the issue. He's doing a lot with pushing for water for farmers throughout California and doing a great job using his pulpit to really push Congress to take a more of a focus on this. And if not for him, I don't think Congress would have the amount of focus it has right now in California if it weren't for Devin Nunes. Now, Dianne Feinstein is coming to the table with saying, listen, we're not going to get anything done if we take the perspective solely of Devin Nunes. We need to come towards a middle of the road. And she tried to broker a compromise in 2014. So what efforts occurred in 2014 with federal drought legislation? The federal drought legislation that we saw primarily throughout 2014 really focused on Endangered Species Act implementation. And the differences of bills really are gutting the Endangered Species Act and redoing how it's implemented in the Bay Delta completely, whether we're in drought time or not, or looking at it with changing the way it's implemented during drought time. So that's really been a crux of the conversation and the problems occurring throughout 2014 to get something done with federal drought legislation. As I mentioned, Dianne Feinstein tried to broker a compromise. That effort failed at the last minute, so nothing was done in 2014. House passed a version of a drought bill in, I want to say October or November, maybe even December of last year. But it went nowhere. It didn't go much of anywhere in the Senate, and the president said that he would veto the bill anyway if it reached his desk. So here we are again in 2015 in California. Like I said, mentioning Jerry Brown, they're doing what they can to manage groundwater, to look at water infrastructure funding, look at water use, cutting water by 20%. You know, how can we save water in urban settings, in urban turf landscape settings through that side of the irrigation industry. But federal, what are we looking at in 2015? So I think what's going to happen is, and I've had various conversations with both folks in California and in Washington, D.C. I think what we're going to see is more of a comprehensive West drought bill. So let's go back real quick and look at the Drought Monitor. And where does this make sense? So the focus right now has been on California because that's where the majority of the drought is. That's where they're in dire drought and in serious need of rain. But if we expanded this focus to include states like Nevada, Oregon, Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, could Congress bring in the support of those members of the Senate and the House to put together more of a comprehensive focus on drought legislation? And I think that's what's happening right now. In fact, I know that conversations are happening right now with bringing in more of a comprehensive view. So let's look at, finally, Farm Bill implementation, and then we can save anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A if any questions pop up. Let's look at Farm Bill implementation. Now, this is really important for our industry, but it's not going to hit the mainstream media or the top focus of what's going to happen in the next 2 years, last 2 years of the president's, under President Obama's presidency. So let's look at what's been done so far. First the bill was passed earlier in 2014. August 4th of 2014, the new Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which is basically the new Ag Water Enhancement Program. The AWAP program is now part of that Regional Conservation Partnership Program. It received nearly 600 initial proposals for that program. December 11th, 2014, the USDA seeks public comment on the new Environmental Quality Incentives Program rule. I'm going to go back to that after I go through this timeline. January 14th, the Ag Secretary announced funding for 115 conservation projects in all 50 states. Okay, so that goes back to August 14th, where they received nearly 600 initial proposals. They then funded 115 of those projects. A handful of them do deal with water quantity use and are looking at on-farm irrigation. So we are going through those 115. It was just announced last month. We're going through those conservation projects in 50 states and looking at which ones really look at on-farm water use, looking at irrigation, and then also looking at irrigation infrastructure efficiency. So looking at how water gets from the canals to the farm itself and where there's opportunities there with funding through these 115 conservation projects. And then finally, the most recent, January 26, 2015, the USDA is seeking applications for new conservation innovation grants. Now let's go back to the USDA seeks public comment on the new Environmental Quality Incentives Program rule. The comments are due on, I think it's next week, February 10th. So basically, in the new Farm Bill, when it was passed, it changed some things in EQIP, streamlined some programs, put some programs together, etc. But looking at what's included in the new Environmental Quality Incentives Program rule, the bulk of that proposed rule deals with irrigation. And specifically within irrigation, it touches on the irrigation history requirement. Now currently, in order for a farmer to receive any kind of cost share funds from EQIP to increase on-farm efficiency through irrigation, that farm needs to prove some sort of water savings occurs. And because you need water savings, you need an irrigation history requirement. And that history irrigation requirement, as deemed by the USDA through a former proposed rule, is that farm would have had to have been irrigated 2 out of the past 5 years. So it could have been 3 years ago, you could have had no irrigation for the past 3 years, but 2 years before that had irrigation. That farmer could still qualify for EQIP funds, or it could be on the last 2 years, or it could be any which way. The 2 out of the past 5 years needs to have some form of irrigation in order to qualify for funding. Now, what this program, what the proposed rule does, it really focuses in on that with giving some exemption. Now, there's already an exemption in place legislatively through the Farm Bill in the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. If a farmer wants to increase irrigation efficiency and does not meet the requirements of the irrigated history requirement, but lives in a state that has been deemed by the Secretary of Congress as not having a significant history of irrigation, that farmer can be exempt, or is exempt from proving the irrigation history requirement. That's only in the Regional Conservation Partnership Program rules, which is basically the old AWEP. Now looking at EQIP, what have they done there? Well, they've limited this a bit more. So they're really focusing in on Indian tribal land irrigation, so irrigation that is run by tribes, Indian tribes, as well as areas that are very low income, under hardship, etc. So they're exempting those farmers. And what the Irrigation Association is looking to do is work with Congress and the House Ag Committee Chair Mike Conaway of Texas and the Senate Ag Committee Chair Pat Roberts of Kansas, and looking to expand that. And if we don't see it as being fair to only give this exemption to a certain subset of farmers. Why not make this exemption available to all farmers? If they don't have the records or for whatever reason, that there are exemptions that can take place. Now, I will say in conversations with folks at EQIP, folks at NRCS, other folks at USDA, irrigation is under a pretty hot spotlight in the EQIP program. The onerous for any kind of irrigation to produce water savings is significant, and in some cases, such as the New York Times reported 2 years ago, can actually lead to an increase in water use. However, what we need to do a better job of as an industry, and I'm going to step on a soapbox here and then move on to a question and answer period, what we need to do as an industry is really promote both the yield portion of the benefits, so the increased yield portion benefits of efficient irrigation, as well as the environmental conservation benefits of efficient irrigation, and mold them into one comprehensive argument that it is a good thing for a farmer to increase yield with the same amount or less than water used on farms through a more efficient irrigation. It's okay for efficient irrigation to lead to conservation as long as the farmer is okay with it. The farmer needs to control it, needs to control the rights. However, if you enter into an ECOP agreement that water savings cannot go into new production, I get it, but as an industry, we need to come together and talk better about these two benefits working in tandem together moving forward. Our industry, our nation, our global population needs an increase in yield, whether it's the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the energy we use. We need more yield. And the way we can do this is through more efficient irrigation. So boxing us in to these stringent requirements through EQIP is becoming more and more of a problem because of the requirements that occur. So this is something that we're working with the agriculture committees on, working with the USDA, and really laying some groundwork for the next Farm Bill. Now with that said, I'm going to open up to Q&A. So if any of you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the box. While you guys think of any questions you may have, I will say that we have upcoming webinars as well for the Bringing Water to Life webinar series. The next one that focuses on agriculture is going to be on May 7th of 2015, and that is going to look at the Colorado River Basin, the future of irrigated agriculture in the Colorado River Basin. It should be a great webinar. We're lining up some speakers as I speak right now, but I know a lot of focus is on the Colorado River Basin and the future of that and how ag is going to be viewed, on how much water is available for it, and the restrictions and the onerous that is going to be placed on ag producers in their water use in that basin is going to be pretty high. So we're looking forward to a lively discussion and presentation on the Colorado River Basin. So with that said, if there are any questions, please type them in now. If there are not any questions, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. So I do not see any right now. All right, so with that said, my email address is on there. If any of you have any questions at all on anything we discussed, please feel free to shoot me off an email. Stay in touch. I encourage you to listen to our upcoming webinars. All of them are listed on irrigation.org/webinar_series. I hope you found this webinar insightful and informative. I'd be more than happy to answer any specific questions you have. I just sent me up an email, and I appreciate everyone attending. So thank you very much.